Hey guys, tonight we're exploring medieval psychology, the ancient science of confidently guessing what's wrong with you and then bleeding about it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. In medieval psychology, sadness was not an emotion. It was not grief. It was not stress. It was not the perfectly reasonable reaction to living in a damp hut while everyone you know slowly died of preventable causes. No, sadness was a fluid problem. Specifically, it was black bile, a cold, dry, mysterious substance that medieval scholars imagined sloshing around inside you like emotional tar. If you felt gloomy, it wasn't because life was hard. It was because your internal plumbing had failed. According to medieval theory, black bile caused melancholy, despair, brooding, and what doctors politely described as excessive thought. Thinking too much, by the way, was a medical red flag. Medieval psychology looked at introspection and said, absolutely not. That's how bile accumulates. The diagnosis was simple. Are you sad? Then congratulations, you are full of bile. The treatment was even simpler. Remove the bile. How? Bloodletting, vomiting, laxatives, sweating, starving. Occasionally all of them in one exciting afternoon. Medieval medicine responded to emotional exhaustion by saying, what if we also make you physically miserable and see which one wins? Doctors took this very seriously. They watched how often you sighed. They tracked your sleep. They analysed whether you stared into the distance too thoughtfully. A person who quietly reflected was considered more dangerous than someone loudly screaming. Silence meant bile was settling, and grief was treated the same way. If your spouse died, medieval psychology didn't recommend comfort, community, or time. It recommended a bowl, a blade, and a firm belief that emotions should be drained like spoiled wine. Creative people were especially doomed. Poets, artists, scholars, anyone who enjoyed thinking, were considered prime candidates for melancholy. Creativity was tolerated only in small doses. Too much imagination caused bile buildup, which caused sadness, which caused treatment, which often caused death. A very efficient system. And here's the best part. If you survived the treatment, the doctor declared success. If you didn't, the problem was technically resolved. Either way, medieval psychology congratulated itself. In an odd way, turning sadness into a substance made it feel controllable. You couldn't understand your emotions, but you could extract them. You couldn't heal your mind, but you could weaken your body until you stopped complaining. Unfortunately, sadness is not a liquid. Black bile does not exist, and bleeding someone does not cure despair. But medieval psychology didn't know that, and it was extremely confident anyway. After medieval psychology decided sadness was a liquid problem, it made another bold discovery. Thinking is risky behavior, not dangerous in a philosophical sense, dangerous in a your brain might overheat and ruin your life sense. Reflection, analysis, and prolonged thought were all considered health hazards. According to medieval scholars, the brain was delicate, soft, moist, extremely sensitive to vibes. If you thought too much, you generated excess heat. That heat dried the brain. A dried brain led to madness, and madness naturally led to consequences that usually involved chains. So, medieval psychology advised moderation in all intellectual activity. You were encouraged to think just enough to do your job, say your prayers, and not ask follow-up questions. Curiosity was tolerated briefly, then monitored closely. Scholars warned that excessive study, reading late at night, or concentrating too intensely could cause mental collapse. Imagine being told that learning Latin was medically risky. Medieval psychology essentially looked at education and said, careful, that's how it starts. Students were advised to take breaks from thinking, long breaks, ideally permanent ones. Overexerting the mind was believed to drain vital spirits, disturb the humours, and invite melancholy. In other words, Thinking too hard made your bile angry again. Everything always came back to bile. The truly unfortunate were philosophers. Medieval society admired philosophers in theory, but distrusted them in practice. A philosopher who asked too many questions wasn't seen as insightful. He was seen as someone courting insanity. If you stared into space too often, people assumed your brain was overheating and quietly rearranging itself. And then there were women. Medieval psychology believed women were especially vulnerable to thinking-related disorders because their brains were supposedly colder, wetter, and more emotionally reactive. This meant that serious intellectual thought was considered not just inappropriate, but medically irresponsible. Education for women wasn't discouraged because of ideology alone. It was discouraged for their own health. Even dreams were suspicious. Vivid dreams meant the imagination was running unchecked, which implied mental imbalance. If you dreamed too creatively, it meant your mind hadn't shut down properly. Sleep was supposed to be passive. If it wasn't, something was wrong. The safest mental state, according to medieval psychology, was mild awareness paired with obedience. Think a little, feel a little, never too much of either. Modern psychology encourages reflection. Medieval psychology encouraged a nap. And honestly, given the circumstances, that might have been the healthiest advice they accidentally gave. Once medieval psychology decided that thinking too much could cook your brain, it made another important discovery. Anger was not emotional. It was internal combustion. Specifically, it was your liver overheating like a poorly ventilated furnace. According to medieval theory, anger came from an excess of yellow bile, a hot and dry substance produced by the liver. If you were calm, your liver was behaving itself. If you were angry, your liver was throwing a tantrum. Emotional regulation, therefore, was not about self-control. It was about temperature management. This meant rage had nothing to do with frustration, injustice, or the fact that medieval life was objectively awful. No, you were angry because your organs were too warm. The solution was obvious. Cool the body, calm the bile, and tell the liver to stop acting up. Treatments included cold baths, cooling diets, and bloodletting. Because apparently removing blood was medieval medicine's answer to everything. If someone had a temper, doctors might recommend avoiding spicy foods, alcohol, sex, and excitement. In short, avoid everything that made life tolerable. Medieval psychology also believed that chronic anger could physically warp your personality. Angry people were described as sharp, bitter, aggressive, and difficult, which, to be fair, is not entirely wrong. But instead of therapy or conflict resolution, the advice was simple. Reduce heat. Eat cold foods. Sit quietly. Do not argue. Ideally, stop having opinions. Men were believed to be more prone to anger because their bodies were naturally hotter. This conveniently explained violence while excusing it. Women, being colder and wetter, were thought to be less angry, unless their moisture levels went wrong, in which case they became hysterical. Medieval psychology was very proud of how neatly it explained everything while understanding nothing. Even righteous anger was discouraged. Excess passion of any kind was dangerous. A man who shouted too much was not standing up for himself. He was medically unbalanced. A woman who expressed anger at all was, well, that was a separate problem involving prayer. In medieval courts, anger was sometimes treated as evidence of poor health rather than bad behavior. If you lashed out, the assumption wasn't that you were wrong. It was that your liver needed intervention. Accountability was optional. Cooling was mandatory. Modern psychology sees anger as a response to stimuli. Medieval psychology saw it as a temperature issue. If only all emotional problems could be solved with fewer spices and a nice cold bath. After medieval psychology finished blaming sadness on bile and anger on overheated organs, it turned its attention to love, and immediately decided that love was not romantic, poetic, or meaningful. Love was a diagnosable illness, temporary, dangerous, and best handled by someone with a knife and a bowl. This condition was known as love sickness, and medieval scholars treated it with the seriousness usually reserved for plague outbreaks. Falling in love caused paleness, insomnia, loss of appetite, obsessive thinking, sudden poetry writing, and an alarming tendency to stare at nothing while smiling. In other words, medieval psychology accidentally described being in love, and then panicked. Doctors believed love disrupted the balance of the humours, overheating the heart and drying the brain. Too much passion sent vital spirits racing through the body like excited children in a monastery. This was unhealthy. Order had been lost. Fluids were misbehaving again. The symptoms were well documented. A lovesick person might sigh excessively, avoid food, speak in metaphors, and lose interest in practical labour. If a peasant stopped ploughing fields because he was thinking about someone's eyes, this was not considered devotion. It was considered a medical emergency. Treatment varied, but none of it involved happiness. Cold baths were common, because medieval medicine firmly believed that romance could be rinsed away. Bloodletting was also popular, because if you were thinking too much about love, clearly you had too much blood. Dietary changes were recommended as well. Bland foods, no spices, no wine, no excitement, and absolutely no seeing the person you loved. Exposure therapy was not part of the plan. In more severe cases, doctors advised marriage, not as a celebration of love, but as containment. If the object of affection was unavailable, the solution was distraction. Travel, prayer, physical labour, or intense supervision were all prescribed. Feelings were not explored. They were redirected like inconvenient river water. Women diagnosed with love sickness were often treated as emotionally unstable, while men were treated as temporarily foolish. This double standard was not subtle. Medieval psychology rarely was. The most tragic part is that love was only tolerated when it behaved itself. Controlled affection within marriage was acceptable. Passion, longing, obsession, or desire, deeply suspicious. Love was allowed only in small, regulated doses, like a dangerous medicine. Modern psychology sees love as attachment, chemistry, and connection. Medieval psychology saw it as a fever, and like all medieval fevers, the solution was to drain something until the problem stopped moving. At this point, medieval psychology had explained sadness with bile, anger with overheated organs, and love with feverish insanity. Naturally, it then turned to women and said, yes, this is their fault. Scientifically. According to medieval thinkers, women were more emotional not because of social conditions, limited rights, constant childbirth, or the fact that medieval life was relentlessly brutal. No, women were emotional because they were wetter, colder, more moist, psychologically soggy. This theory was taken very seriously. Medieval psychology believed that the ideal human temperament was hot and dry. Dryness meant stability. Heat meant energy. Men, conveniently, were described as naturally hotter and drier, which explained why they were rational, authoritative, and allowed to speak in public without supervision. Women, on the other hand, were believed to be colder and wetter. Moisture, according to medieval science, caused instability. Emotions slipped around. Thoughts didn't set properly. Reason failed to harden. The mind, like damp bread, simply refused to behave. This moisture theory explained everything medieval society already wanted to believe. Emotional expression, moisture, crying, excess moisture escaping, anger, improper fluid distribution, intelligence. Possible, but risky. Too much thinking could overheat the already damp brain, which was obviously a problem. As a result, education for women was considered medically questionable. Intellectual activity might imbalance their humours, dry out their moisture, or, worse, give them opinions. Medieval psychology framed restriction as protection. We're not limiting you, they said. We're preserving your health. Medical texts warned that women needed supervision, moderation, and control to maintain balance. Strong emotions were considered dangerous, not because they were powerful, but because they disrupted the fragile moisture equilibrium. Emotional regulation was not encouraged. Emotional containment was. Even childbirth reinforced these beliefs. The physical processes of pregnancy and menstruation were interpreted as evidence that women were governed by fluids. This made them mysterious, unpredictable, and, therefore, suspicious. Psychology became an excuse for social hierarchy. What medieval scholars never considered was that maybe women were emotional because their lives were constrained, dangerous, and exhausting. That idea would have required thinking, and thinking, as we've established, was dangerous. Modern psychology recognizes emotion as human. Medieval psychology blamed water, and somehow, this explanation survived for centuries, proving that confidence, not accuracy, is often the most persuasive force of all. Once medieval psychology finished blaming emotions on fluids, temperature, and dampness, it turned its attention to dreams, and immediately decided that the brain could not possibly be responsible. Dreams were not random, they were not memory fragments, they were not the result of stress, digestion, or that questionable cheese you ate before bed. Dreams were messages. The only question was, messages from whom? According to medieval thinkers, dreams could come from God, angels, demons, the stars, your bodily humours, or your dinner, sometimes all at once. Interpretation was everything. A dream wasn't something you experienced, it was something you needed decoded before it ruined your life. Pleasant dreams were suspicious. Why was your mind so relaxed? What were you forgetting to repent for? Nightmares, on the other hand, were very useful. They could indicate sin, spiritual attack, demonic influence, or internal imbalance. Medieval psychology loved dreams because no matter what happened, it was definitely your fault. Medical texts explain dreams as vapors rising from the stomach to the brain during sleep. If those vapors were heavy, you had dark dreams. If they were light, you had pleasant ones. If they were chaotic, you were ill. This meant digestion was not just important for health, it was shaping your subconscious. Dream interpretation manuals became wildly popular. These books listed symbols and their meanings with impressive confidence. Snakes meant betrayal, fire meant passion or damnation, falling meant moral weakness, teeth falling out meant something bad. It was never good. Dreams were rarely interpreted as neutral. Medieval psychology didn't believe in neutral mental experiences. Monks took dreams especially seriously. A single vivid dream could lead to days of prayer, fasting, and anxiety. Dreams were treated as evidence of temptation, evidence of divine testing, evidence that your mind was not under proper control. Even erotic dreams were considered moral failures, despite happening while unconscious. Medieval psychology managed to invent guilt that operated independently of your awareness. You could sin in your sleep and still be held accountable. Truly impressive. Modern psychology sees dreams as the brain processing information. Medieval psychology saw them as supernatural performance reviews. And like all performance reviews, they were stressful, confusing, and never quite explained what you were supposed to do better next time. After medieval psychology finished blaming your emotions on fluids and your dreams on divine messaging systems, it arrived at one of its boldest conclusions. If your mind was struggling, you had done something wrong. Mental illness was not a condition, it was not a health issue, it was a character flaw with spiritual consequences. If someone behaved erratically, heard voices, withdrew from society, or experienced intense fear, medieval psychology didn't ask what they were experiencing internally. It asked what sin had caused it. Madness was understood as punishment, possession, or weakness of faith. Sometimes all three, if the situation called for enthusiasm. This belief was incredibly convenient. If mental suffering came from moral failure, then society didn't need to offer care, support, or understanding. It needed discipline, correction, prayer, and occasionally restraint. People with mental illness were often encouraged to confess, repent, fast, or pray harder. If that didn't work, the assumption was not that the treatment was ineffective. It was that the person was resisting divine help. Responsibility always flowed downward. In more extreme cases, individuals were restrained, isolated, or handed over to religious authorities. Not for cruelty, but for correction. Medieval psychology truly believed that isolation and punishment could bring the mind back into alignment. If someone screamed, it meant the soul was fighting. If someone went silent, it meant the soul was losing. Either outcome was interpreted as progress. There was also a hierarchy of acceptable suffering. Melancholy among scholars was tolerated. Madness among peasants was suspicious. A noble behaving strangely was eccentric. A poor person doing the same thing was dangerous. Psychology adapted beautifully to social class. The most uncomfortable truth is that medieval psychology wasn't trying to be cruel. It was trying to impose order. A world without explanations is terrifying, so medieval thinkers created explanations that preserved authority and moral clarity. Unfortunately, those explanations turned suffering into guilt. Modern psychology recognizes mental illness as complex, biological, psychological, and social. Medieval psychology saw it as disobedience. And once you define illness as sin, the cure stops being compassion and starts being control, which medieval society was very good at. Once medieval psychology decided that mental suffering was a moral issue, it moved on to fear, and immediately concluded that fear was not an emotion, but a mechanical failure. Fear didn't come from danger, uncertainty, or the perfectly reasonable awareness that medieval life was horrifying. Fear came from weak blood flow. According to medieval thinkers, courage was the result of warm, fast-moving blood circulating bravely through the body. Fear happened when blood cooled, slowed, or retreated inward like it had lost confidence. A frightened person wasn't cautious, they were poorly circulated. This explained everything medieval society already believed. Brave men were hot-blooded, cowards were cold, literally. Fear caused the heart to shrink, the limbs to tremble, and the face to pale, all signs that the vital spirits were fleeing the battlefield. Medieval psychology saw fear and said, "Ah yes, your blood has abandoned you." Treatment followed predictable logic. To cure fear, you had to warm the body and stimulate circulation. This meant hot foods, wine, spices, physical exertion, and, occasionally, yelling at the frightened person until they improved. If you were afraid, you weren't offered reassurance. You were encouraged to toughen up metabolically. Soldiers who panicked in battle were not considered traumatized. They were defective. Their blood was weak. Their hearts were cold. Fear was not a survival instinct. It was a personal failure with biological implications. Women, naturally, were considered more fearful because they were colder by nature. Children were fearful because their bodies were still forming. Elderly people were fearful because their heat was fading. In every case, fear was framed as physical decline rather than emotional response. What medieval psychology never considered was that fear is often intelligent. Fear keeps you alive. Fear tells you when something is dangerous. Fear is information. But acknowledging that would have required admitting that panic in a plague-ridden city might be reasonable. And medieval psychology did not reward reason. Even nightmares were linked to fear's physicality. If you woke trembling, it meant your blood had cooled too much during sleep. The solution wasn't comfort. It was warmth. More blankets. More food. Less thinking. Always less thinking. Modern psychology treats fear as a protective response. Medieval psychology treated it as a circulation problem. And honestly, given the lack of safety equipment, maybe fear was the healthiest instinct people had, even if medieval science spent centuries trying to beat it out of them. After medieval psychology blamed your emotions on fluids, temperature, morality, and blood flow, it reached what it considered the final, irrefutable explanation. The planets did it. According to medieval belief, your personality, emotions, and mental stability were heavily influenced by the position of celestial bodies at the moment you were born. Not metaphorically, literally. Mars didn't just symbolize anger, it installed it. Saturn didn't suggest melancholy. It personally delivered it, signed, sealed, and guaranteed. This meant your mind wasn't fully yours. It was leased. Astrology was not fringe thinking. It was mainstream psychology. Scholars, physicians, and clergy all agreed that the heavens shaped human thought the way the moon shaped the tides, except with more paperwork and fewer refunds. If you were anxious, Mercury was acting up. If you were aggressive, Mars was nearby. If you were sad, Saturn had parked itself in the wrong house. And if your life was falling apart entirely, congratulations, you were born at an inconvenient time. Birth charts were treated like psychological profiles. Doctors consulted them before making diagnoses. Kings consulted them before making decisions. Parents consulted them to explain why one child was calm and the other one was like that. The beauty of astrology was that it explained everything while absolving everyone. Your temper wasn't your fault. Your sadness wasn't your fault. Your terrible decision-making wasn't your fault. It was written in the stars. Accountability floated somewhere between Jupiter and nowhere. Even treatment depended on astrology. Certain days were considered better for bloodletting, purging, or emotional correction. Performing a medical procedure under the wrong planetary alignment could make things worse, which was impressive, considering how bad things already were. Medieval psychology also believed planetary influence could wax and wane. You might be emotionally stable one month and unhinged the next, simply because Venus had moved. This made self-reflection unnecessary. Why improve yourself when the universe might fix it next Tuesday? Modern psychology studies patterns, biology, and environment. Medieval psychology studied the sky and said, yes, that explains your personality. And while astrology today is mostly used for entertainment, medieval society used it as therapy, diagnosis, and excuse generator. If nothing else, it was comforting. Your problems weren't random. They were cosmically scheduled. After medieval psychology outsourced your personality to the planets, it decided to take a look inside the human head, without actually opening it, of course, and announced another breakthrough. The brain is a building. A very small, very damp building with designated rooms for thinking. According to medieval scholars, the brain was divided into compartments, or cells, each responsible for a different mental function. Memory lived in one chamber. Imagination lived in another. Reason occupied the front, because obviously reason wanted a window. If one room malfunctioned, that explained everything. This model was taken extremely seriously. If you forgot things, your memory chamber was weak. If you hallucinated, your imagination room was unsupervised. If you made bad decisions, your reason chamber was poorly furnished. Mental illness was now an interior design issue. Medical texts described these chambers in impressive detail, despite no one having actually seen them. The front of the brain handled reasoning, the middle dealt with imagination, and the back stored memory, which explained why head injuries were terrifying. A blow to the wrong spot didn't just hurt, it redecorated your mind. And yes, medieval psychology believed these chambers could be physically affected by diet, emotions, and weather. Cold air made the brain too moist. Heat dried it out. Excess thinking overheated specific rooms. The brain, in medieval theory, was basically a medieval house with terrible insulation and constant mold problems. This belief shaped treatment. To improve memory, doctors recommended strengthening the memory chamber with herbs, prayers, repetition, and sometimes strong smells, because nothing sharpens recall like being assaulted by incense. If imagination ran wild, patients were advised to reduce stimulation, avoid stories, and stop thinking creatively, which medieval psychology considered a perfectly reasonable request. Education was also shaped by this model. Learning too much too fast was dangerous. You might overload a chamber. Better to memorize slowly, cautiously, and under supervision. A mind bursting with knowledge was not impressive. It was structurally unsound. Modern neuroscience maps networks and processes. Medieval psychology drew floor plans. And while the idea of mental rooms sounds ridiculous now, it gave medieval thinkers a sense of control. If the mind had structure, it could be managed. If it could be managed, it could be corrected, even if the blueprint was completely imaginary. After medieval psychology carefully explained where your memories were stored and which room imagination was misbehaving in, it turned its suspicious gaze toward happiness and immediately decided that too much joy was a medical risk. Yes, being happy was fine. Being very happy, deeply concerning. According to medieval thinkers, intense joy overheated the heart, and an overheated heart was dangerous. The heart, remember, was not just a pump. It was the emotional command center. If joy became excessive, the heart expanded, spirits rushed, balance collapsed, and sudden death politely showed up uninvited. This meant medieval psychology genuinely warned people against excitement. Sudden good news was risky. Laughter needed moderation. Celebration required restraint. If someone experienced overwhelming happiness, doctors advised calm, rest, and emotional cooling, because joy, left unchecked, could kill you faster than sadness ever did. And medieval texts were full of examples meant to terrify readers into emotional moderation. Stories of people who laughed themselves to death, people who collapsed from excitement, people who received wonderful news and immediately expired. Whether these stories were exaggerated, misunderstood, or completely fictional did not matter. They were cited confidently, and confidence was medieval psychology's strongest instrument. Even love-related happiness was dangerous. Too much delight in romance could weaken the body. Passion stirred spirits too aggressively. A joyful heart was a reckless heart. The safest emotional state, according to medieval wisdom, was calm contentment with a light sprinkle of concern. This belief made emotional restraint virtuous. A composed person was healthy. A visibly joyful person was suspicious. Someone laughing loudly in public was either drunk, sinful, or moments away from collapse. Monastic life reinforced this idea. Excess emotion, joy included, disrupted spiritual focus. Smiling too much could indicate pride. Laughter might invite temptation. Medieval psychology quietly suggested that serenity was the only safe emotional speed. Modern psychology encourages joy, connection, and emotional expression. Medieval psychology encouraged emotional cruise control. And in a world where happiness could be taken away at any moment by disease, famine, or war, perhaps distrusting joy felt logical. If you never let yourself feel too happy, you never risked losing it. It wasn't optimism. It was emotional risk management. And medieval psychology was very, very risk-averse, especially when it came to smiling too hard. After medieval psychology decided that too much happiness could kill you, it turned its attention to children and made another confident conclusion. Children were not fully human yet, not metaphorically, literally incomplete, like unfinished furniture that hadn't set properly. Medieval thinkers believed children were governed almost entirely by moisture. Their bodies were soft, wet, and unstable. Their minds were even worse. A child's brain, according to medieval psychology, had not hardened enough to support proper reason. This explained everything from tantrums to curiosity, to the fact that children asked inconvenient questions. Children weren't seen as developing psychologically. They were seen as lacking structure. Their thoughts slipped. Their emotions overflowed. Their attention wandered. None of this was considered normal development. It was considered evidence of deficiency. As a result, emotional expression in children wasn't explored or nurtured. It was corrected. Loud laughter, excess spirits, crying, weak control, fear, cold blood, curiosity, dangerous thinking. Childhood was not a stage to be understood. It was a condition to be managed. Education reflected this belief. Learning was heavily focused on memorization and obedience. Imagination was discouraged because it strengthened the wrong brain chamber. Too much play was wasteful. Too much questioning was suspicious. A good child was quiet, compliant, and emotionally restrained, essentially a small adult with worse coordination. Discipline was harsh, not because medieval parents were uniquely cruel, but because psychology supported it. If children were unstable, then firmness created structure. Pain was instructional. Fear was corrective. Affection was optional. Even affection itself was treated cautiously. Too much warmth might spoil a child's temperament. Too much comfort might prevent the humours from settling properly. Medieval psychology believed resilience came from restraint, not support. And because children were seen as unfinished, their emotions were rarely taken seriously. A child in distress wasn't anxious or overwhelmed. They were misaligned. The solution was correction, not conversation. Modern psychology sees childhood as foundational. Medieval psychology saw it as a problem to survive. Children weren't encouraged to grow emotionally. They were expected to harden. And in a world that demanded endurance above all else, medieval psychology believed it was doing them a favour, even if it never once asked how the children felt about it. After medieval psychology decided children needed hardening rather than nurturing, it turned to adults and announced another solution to mental distress: stop talking. Silence, according to medieval thinkers, was not just polite, it was therapeutic. Words stirred the mind. Thoughts followed words, emotions followed thoughts. And emotions, as we've established, were dangerous, damp, overheated, morally suspicious, and probably full of bile. Therefore, silence was medicine. Monastic psychology perfected this idea. Monks believed that speech scattered the mind, while silence gathered it back into order. Talking too much weakened reason. Joking was risky. Complaining was spiritually corrosive. Silence allowed thoughts to settle, humours to calm, and the soul to stop doing whatever it had been doing wrong. Even outside monasteries, medieval psychology encouraged restrained speech. A quiet person was considered wise. A talkative person was considered unstable. Someone who spoke passionately or emotionally was not expressive. They were imbalanced. Excess words meant excess thought, and excess thought led directly back to madness. Silence was especially recommended for people experiencing distress. Feeling anxious? Be silent. Feeling sad? Be silent. Feeling angry? Definitely be silent. Medieval psychology believed that speaking about emotions amplified them, much like blowing on a fire. Suppressing thoughts wasn't repression, it was maintenance. This belief also made silence a moral virtue. Quiet people were disciplined, loud people were suspect. Speaking out, especially against authority, wasn't framed as dissent. It was framed as psychological instability. If you objected too strongly, perhaps your humours were acting up. Women were encouraged towards silence more than men. Emotional speech was seen as proof of instability, and silence was framed as protection. Medieval psychology didn't silence people by accident. It medicalized silence. And to be fair, silence sometimes helped. In a chaotic, noisy world, quiet moments probably did calm the mind. But medieval psychology didn't stop there. It didn't recommend balance. It recommended suppression. Modern psychology encourages expression, reflection, and communication. Medieval psychology encouraged quiet obedience. Silence wasn't about understanding yourself, it was about containing yourself. And in a society obsessed with order, silence was the most efficient mental health tool they had, even if it solved nothing and taught people to suffer quietly. After medieval psychology explained emotions with fluids, fear with circulation, joy with heart explosions, and silence as therapy, it arrived at its grand unifying theory. The mind did not exist on its own. There was no such thing as mental health. There was only spiritual alignment. Thoughts, emotions, behaviours, all of it was inseparable from the soul. If your mind struggled, it meant your soul was out of order. If your emotions overflowed, your soul lacked discipline. If you felt despair, confusion, or anxiety, medieval psychology didn't ask what happened to you. It asked what you had failed to do. This made psychological suffering incredibly easy to explain, and incredibly hard to escape. If the mind was simply a reflection of spiritual health, then the solution was not understanding, support, or care. The solution was obedience, prayer, repentance, moral correction. Mental distress was treated the same way moral failure was treated, with instruction and control. This belief wrapped every psychological concept we've discussed into one airtight system. Sadness wasn't an emotion, it was spiritual imbalance. Anger wasn't frustration, it was moral heat. Fear wasn't instinct, it was weakness of faith. Joy wasn't relief, it was spiritual risk. And because the soul was eternal, suffering was often framed as purposeful. Endurance built virtue, struggle refined character. Mental pain was not something to remove, it was something to survive quietly and learn from. In a strange way, this worldview gave meaning to suffering. If pain had purpose, then it wasn't random, it wasn't meaningless. But it also meant that asking for help was dangerous. Seeking relief could be interpreted as avoiding spiritual growth. Authority benefited enormously from this belief. If distress was spiritual, then priests, not patients, held the answers. Obedience became therapy. Submission became healing. And questioning the system wasn't curiosity, it was rebellion. Modern psychology separates mind, body, and belief, while recognizing their interaction. Medieval psychology fused them into one moral equation. And while that system helped medieval society maintain order, it did so by misunderstanding the mind entirely. The medieval world didn't lack intelligence. It lacked tools. So it built explanations out of what it had. Faith, tradition, fear, and confidence. And it believed them completely, which may be the most human psychological trait of all. If there's one psychological principle medieval thinkers truly mastered, even if by accident, it's this: confidence beats correctness every time. Medieval popular psychology worked not because it was accurate, but because it was delivered with absolute certainty. There were no maybes, no, we're still studying this, no, results may vary. Every explanation arrived fully formed, confident, and unwilling to be questioned. Sad, black bile, angry, hot liver, confused, planetary interference, dreamed something weird, spiritual issue, struggling mentally, moral failure, no ambiguity, no uncertainty, just answers, and people loved that. In a world filled with famine, disease, war, and death, certainty was comforting. Not knowing why something happened was terrifying. So, medieval psychology didn't leave space for doubt. It filled every gap with explanation, even if the explanation was nonsense. Especially if it was nonsense, because nonsense can't be disproven easily. These ideas spread because they were simple, repeatable, and authoritative. Anyone could learn them. Anyone could apply them. You didn't need training, research, or evidence. You needed confidence and a straight face. And once an idea was accepted, it became self-reinforcing. If a treatment worked, it proved the theory. If it failed, the patient was at fault. If someone recovered, the system took credit. If someone didn't, the system explained why they deserved it. That's not bad science. That's excellent propaganda. Medieval psychology also benefited from hierarchy. Knowledge flowed downward. Scholars spoke. Everyone else listened. Questioning wasn't curiosity. It was instability. Doubt itself became a symptom. And here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't just medieval. Modern people like to think we're immune to confident nonsense. We are not. We still gravitate towards simple explanations, neat labels, and theories that tell us who's at fault. We still prefer certainty over complexity. We still confuse confidence with truth. The medieval world didn't fail because it was stupid. It failed because it was human. Given limited tools, limited data, and overwhelming fear, people created explanations that felt right and defended them fiercely. Psychology wasn't about understanding minds. It was about maintaining order, reducing uncertainty, and making suffering feel explainable. So when we laugh at medieval psychology, we're not just mocking the past, we're seeing a version of ourselves, just with worse hygiene and stronger opinions. And that might be the most psychologically accurate conclusion medieval science never meant to reach. In the 3rd century before Christ, the Adriatic Sea was not a peaceful stretch of blue water connecting friendly ports. It was a contested highway of warships, merchant convoys, and coastal strongholds, where power belonged to whoever could control the waves. Along its eastern shore lay Illyria, a rugged land of mountains, islands, and fiercely independent tribes whose strength came not from vast armies, but from the sea itself. It was into this maritime world that Teuta of Illyria rose to power. Teuta did not inherit a quiet throne. She became regent after the sudden death of King Agron, ruling on behalf of his young son Pinnes. To outsiders, especially the Greek city-states and the rising Roman Republic, this arrangement looked fragile. A woman in command, governing a warrior society known for raiding and seafaring, seemed unlikely to last. Yet those assumptions revealed more about foreign prejudice than Illyrian reality. Illyrian society was accustomed to strong leaders who proved themselves through action, rather than lineage alone. Teuta understood this instinctively. Instead of softening Agron's policies or retreating into diplomacy, she embraced the foundations of Illyrian power: ships, sailors, and dominance of the Adriatic coast. Under her regency, Illyria did not pause or hesitate. It expanded. The Illyrian navy grew more organized and more aggressive. Fast, light vessels patrolled the coastline and island chains, striking merchant ships and enemy ports with precision. To the Illyrians, these actions were not criminal piracy, but an accepted extension of maritime warfare. Control of the sea meant survival, wealth, and leverage. Teuta defended this worldview fiercely, refusing to distinguish between raiding and rule. From her coastal strongholds, Teuta governed not as a ceremonial figure, but as a naval commander. She delegated authority to trusted captains, fortified ports, and encouraged the continuation of seaborne raids that filled Illyrian coffers and kept rival powers uneasy. Her rule signaled continuity, not weakness. What truly unsettled her neighbours was not just the raids, but the confidence behind them. Teuta acted like a sovereign who expected obedience, not permission. She ruled as if the Adriatic already belonged to her, and in many ways it did. For a brief but decisive moment, Illyria was no longer reacting to larger powers. Under Teuta, it was challenging them directly, ship by ship, wave by wave. Teuta's power rested on a principle that terrified her neighbours and unified her people. The sea obeyed Illyrian law, not foreign complaints. Along the Adriatic coast, generations of Illyrians had lived by maritime raiding. Ships were tools of survival, and taking cargo from passing merchants was considered no different from taxing land routes or seizing enemy livestock. When Teuta assumed regency, she did not attempt to reform this tradition. She formalized it. Rather than treating raids as uncontrolled acts of banditry, Teuta allowed local commanders wide autonomy at sea. Captains operated under the understanding that success brought reward, failure brought punishment, and loyalty to the crown was non-negotiable. This system created a ruthless but effective naval culture. Illyrian ships became faster, bolder, and more coordinated. Coastal cities that resisted were harassed. Those that cooperated were left untouched. To Greek merchants and Roman traders, this distinction meant little. Their ships were still boarded, their crews threatened, and their cargo seized. Complaints began to flood diplomatic channels, especially from Rome, which was just beginning to look eastward across the Adriatic. Roman senators labelled these actions piracy, a word loaded with moral outrage and political justification. Teuta rejected the label entirely. When Roman envoys arrived to demand restraint, they expected negotiation. What they encountered instead was a ruler who spoke from a position of strength. Teuta reportedly argued that Illyrian custom did not forbid private citizens from taking wealth at sea. The state was not responsible for the actions of individual sailors. To Rome, this sounded like arrogance. To Illyria, it was a declaration of sovereignty. This moment marked a fundamental clash of worldviews. Rome believed law flowed from centralized authority. Teuta ruled a kingdom where power flowed outward, delegated to warriors who earned their keep through conquest. Neither side misunderstood the other. They simply refused to yield. By defending Illyrian maritime customs, Teuta was not provoking war out of recklessness. She was preserving the economic backbone of her realm. To restrict naval raids would weaken her captains, her treasury, and her legitimacy. Authority in Illyria depended on visible strength, especially from a female ruler navigating a violent political landscape. What Rome saw as lawlessness, Teuta saw as order. And as Roman patience thinned, the Adriatic began to feel less like a shared sea and more like a fault line, one that would soon fracture into open war. For years, Rome had tolerated instability beyond the Adriatic with irritation rather than urgency. Illyria was distant, fragmented, and useful mainly as a source of timber, slaves, and trade routes. But under Teuta of Illyria, Illyrian activity at sea stopped being an inconvenience and became an embarrassment. Roman merchants were attacked with increasing boldness, and worse still, Rome's authority was being openly dismissed. The breaking point came when Roman envoys were sent across the Adriatic to confront the Illyrian court. Diplomacy was meant to reassert Roman superiority without bloodshed. Instead, it exposed just how little Teuta feared Roman threats. She refused to curb Illyrian naval practices and allegedly allowed violence against one of the ambassadors on the return journey. Whether ordered directly or merely tolerated, the message was unmistakable. Illyria did not bow. In Roman political culture, such an insult could not go unanswered. Rome was still shaping its identity as a Mediterranean power, and prestige mattered as much as territory. To allow a foreign queen to challenge Roman authority at sea would signal weakness, not just to Illyria, but to every coastal state watching closely. The Senate responded decisively. What began as a dispute over piracy was reframed as a moral crusade. Rome declared that it was not conquering, but restoring order. The First Roman-Illyrian War was justified as a necessary intervention against chaos, even though Rome had little experience with large-scale naval campaigns in the Adriatic. For Teuta, Rome's declaration of war was not unexpected. She had ruled long enough to know that power invites confrontation. Yet Illyria was not defenseless. Its coastline was dotted with fortified cities, its sailors experienced in fast strikes and retreats, and its knowledge of local waters unmatched. The Adriatic was still Illyrian territory, at least for now. However, Rome brought something Illyria lacked: overwhelming resources and relentless organization. Roman fleets crossed the sea with clear objectives, targeting coastal strongholds one by one. Cities that had once relied on Illyrian protection began to waver, calculating survival over loyalty. The war marked a turning point. For the first time, Teuta faced an enemy that could not be intimidated by reputation alone. The Adriatic was no longer just a battlefield of ships and raids. It had become the front line of a struggle between two visions of power, and only one of them would ultimately dominate the sea. When Roman fleets began appearing along the Adriatic shoreline, the war ceased to be an abstract threat and became a daily reality. Ports that once thrived on Illyrian protection now faced a brutal choice: resist Rome and risk destruction, or defect and survive. For Teuta of Illyria, this was the most dangerous phase of her rule, because naval power alone could not guarantee loyalty on land. Rome advanced methodically. Instead of chasing Illyrian raiders at sea, Roman commanders targeted coastal cities, cutting away the infrastructure that supported Teuta's fleet. One by one, strongholds fell or surrendered. Some cities were taken by force, others opened their gates without a fight, hoping Roman protection would be more predictable than Illyrian dominance. Teuta responded in the way Illyrian rulers always had, by relying on speed, intimidation, and geography. Her ships continued to strike Roman supply lines, harassing fleets and disrupting communications. Narrow channels, rocky shores, and hidden harbours favoured Illyrian sailors, who knew every inlet and current. Roman ships, heavier and less agile, struggled in these unfamiliar waters. Yet this advantage could not offset Rome's persistence. Where Illyrian warfare emphasized swift blows, Roman warfare emphasized endurance. Losses were replaced quickly, fleets were repaired, troops returned in greater numbers. Each Roman victory, however small, chipped away at Tutor's authority. The psychological impact was just as severe. Illyrian commanders, who had once acted independently, now faced an enemy that punished hesitation and rewarded betrayal. Some local leaders abandoned Tutor, negotiating their own terms with Rome. Each defection weakened the illusion of unity that had sustained Illyrian power. As pressure mounted, Tutor withdrew from the most exposed coastal positions, retreating inland and relying on fortified centres farther from Roman reach. This strategic pullback preserved her personal safety, but signalled a loss of control over the sea. The Adriatic, once ruled by Illyrian ships, was slowly slipping from her grasp. The war revealed a harsh truth. Tutor had mastered Illyrian traditions of power, but Rome was fighting a different kind of war, one built on discipline, logistics, and long-term occupation. The clash was no longer about piracy or pride. It was about survival, and Illyria was being forced into a defensive posture it had never truly known. As Roman pressure intensified, the war reached its decisive phase. Illyria could still wound Rome, but it could no longer stop it. The steady fall of coastal cities cut off Tutor's access to the sea, strangling the very source of her authority. Without ports, fleets became liabilities. Ships needed harbours, supplies, and safe passage. Rome understood this and pressed its advantage relentlessly. Facing the collapse of her maritime network, Tutor made a strategic choice rooted in survival rather than pride. She entered negotiations with Rome, not as a defeated pirate queen, but as a ruler seeking to preserve what remained of her kingdom. The resulting settlement was harsh. Illyria was forced to pay tribute, surrender control of much of its coastline, and limit its naval operations. Illyrian ships were forbidden from sailing south of a defined boundary without Roman permission. The Adriatic, once her domain, was now regulated by Roman law. Most striking of all was Tutor's removal from power. Whether she formally abdicated or was politically sidelined, her reign effectively ended with the war. Rome installed client rulers more willing to comply with its demands, ensuring Illyria would never again challenge Roman shipping with the same confidence. Yet defeat did not erase Tutor's legacy. Rome had won militarily, but it had not silenced the message of her rule. For the first time, Rome had fought a war triggered not by conquest alone, but by resistance to a female sovereign who refused to be intimidated. Roman historians later portrayed her as reckless and arrogant, framing the conflict as a necessary lesson in order. But beneath that narrative lay an uncomfortable truth. Tutor had forced Rome to take Illyria seriously. Even in loss, she reshaped the balance of power. The war marked Rome's first major intervention east of the Adriatic, opening the path for future expansion into the Balkans and Greece. Illyria became a testing ground for Roman imperial policy, a place where Rome learned how to dominate maritime regions through control rather than annihilation. Tutor disappeared from the historical record after her fall, but her shadow lingered. She had ruled at the edge of empire and refused to retreat quietly. Though stripped of her fleet and crown, she left behind a warning etched into Roman memory. The sea was never truly tamed, and those who challenged it could force even Rome to act. With Tutor removed from power, Rome did what it always did after victory. It seized control not only of territory, but of the narrative. Roman historians, senators, and later chroniclers framed the First Roman-Illyrian War as a civilizing mission. Illyria was portrayed as lawless, its sailors as pirates, and its queen as an unstable ruler who needed to be put in her place. This version of events would dominate surviving sources for centuries. In Roman accounts, Tutor of Illyria appears less as a sovereign and more as a cautionary tale. She is described as arrogant, impulsive, and incapable of governing responsibly. Her defense of Illyrian maritime customs was twisted into evidence of moral failure. By reducing her rule to personality flaws, Rome avoided acknowledging the legitimacy of Illyrian power or the effectiveness of her leadership. What these sources rarely admit is how seriously Rome took her. The Senate did not mobilize fleets and legions against figures it considered insignificant. Rome crossed the Adriatic because Teuto's policies disrupted trade, challenged authority, and exposed Roman vulnerability at sea. In practical terms, she forced Rome to adapt, to build stronger naval presence, and to rethink how it managed maritime frontiers. The rewriting of her image served a political purpose. By casting Teuta as reckless, Rome justified future interventions. Any resistance could now be labelled piracy. Any defiance could be framed as chaos requiring Roman order. Illyria became an example, a warning to other coastal powers that independence would be punished and remembered unfavourably, yet the very hostility of Roman writing preserves Teuta's importance. If she had been weak, she would have been ignored. Instead, she became a symbol of disorder, precisely because she had disrupted Rome's sense of control. Her gender amplified this reaction. A woman exercising naval authority unsettled Roman expectations, making it easier to reduce her to caricature rather than confront the implications of her rule. Outside Roman texts, Illyrian voices are almost entirely